It's August 2014, and you've got a completely routine evening shift at an isolated rail yard out in Tehachapi, California. A 38-year-old mechanic named Robert Limon is working alone. By all accounts, he's just an easygoing, well-liked guy. No known enemies, right? Well, later that night, a coworker walks in and finds him on the floor. He's been shot twice. The whole scene is completely trashed, so investigators immediately treat it like a robbery gone wrong. I mean, it's the obvious read. But there is one massive, glaring issue with that theory. How exactly do you solve a robbery where nothing is actually stolen? Literally nothing was taken from that remote office. No debts, no trouble, no obvious motive. On paper, this was a total ghost of a case. But then you contrast that baffling, silent crime scene with this absolutely chilling audio from a police wiretap. What you're hearing is a frantic prayer. It's between Robert's wife, Sabrina Limon, and her boyfriend, a 24-year-old firefighter named Jonathan Hearn. While detectives are out there supposedly hitting dead ends, Sabrina and Jonathan are actively coaching each other on the phone, figuring out exactly how much to say to the cops. They're literally begging for wisdom to, quote, have the right words, all while trying to keep this incredibly dark secret buried under the guise of, living for a higher purpose. It's wild. All right, let's really dive into this. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're breaking down the anatomy of an interrogation, specifically focusing on the unraveling of Sabrina Limon. You see, this wasn't a case that got solved by some random smoking gun left at the scene. No, this was a supposedly perfect crime that got completely dismantled, piece by piece, through psychological tells, verbal leaks, and honestly, an absolute masterclass in police interviewing. We're going to see exactly how investigators used the power of silence, timeline evidence, and Sabrina's very own words right against her. Okay, so set the scene. It's November 19, 2014. Sabrina sits down in a small interrogation room with detectives for what is about to become a grueling 5-hour game of cat and mouse. Now, the dramatic irony here is just heavy. When Sabrina walks through that door, she genuinely thinks she's just having a friendly chat to clear some things up. She has absolutely zero clue that the detectives already have CCTV footage of a mystery man on a motorcycle. They already have those wiretaps we just talked about, and they already know all about a hidden burner phone. They are holding literally all the cards, but they don't show them. Instead, they just sit back and they let Sabrina talk. And, human psychology betrays us so incredibly fast. Detectives have a specific term for what Sabrina starts doing almost the second she sits down: over-explaining. When a detective simply asks how she met Jonathan at the store where she worked, she immediately volunteers that she instantly felt, quote, guilty about giving him her number. Wait, what? Nobody asked her to explain any guilt. She's offering up a defense before there's even an accusation on the table. She's answering questions that haven't even been asked yet. It is the absolute classic hallmark of someone rehearsing a carefully crafted story, rather than, just remembering an event. And the sheer scale of the deception these two were hiding, it is staggering. I mean, let's talk numbers for a second. 7,333. That is the exact number of text messages and phone calls Sabrina and Jonathan exchanged in just under 5 months. That's nearly 50 contacts a day. And they weren't doing this on their regular cell phones either. They were using a dedicated burner phone that Jonathan bought specifically so Robert wouldn't catch on. This wasn't just some casual weekend fling. This was a total, all-consuming obsession. But this obsession didn't just happen overnight, right? It escalated really systematically. Back in 2008, Sabrina and Robert had actually agreed to an open marriage lifestyle with this tight group of friends they playfully called the Wolf Pack. But by early 2014, Sabrina wanted something else. Her affair with Jonathan completely crossed a line that even their open marriage rules didn't cover. So when Robert caught them, he demanded the affair end. But did they stop? Nope, they just went underground. On April 15th, 2014, that burner phone is activated. And just 4 months later, on August 17th, Robert is murdered at work. Looking at this timeline, you see two people actively constructing a future together, a future that relied 100% on the removal of her husband. Which brings us to the massive cognitive dissonance these two were living in. On the wiretaps, they constantly claim they just want to live a pure life for God, but the brutal reality of their actions keeps slipping through the cracks. In one recorded prayer, Jonathan explicitly says out loud, "I'm not a murderer, God," and then immediately asks for forgiveness for their wrongful, sinful adultery and bloodshed. Bloodshed. They were literally using this intense religious language in prayer as a bizarre psychological shield. Like if they prayed hard enough, it would justify and conceal an active, premeditated murder plot. So, fast forward deep into the interrogation. Detectives finally decide to show Sabrina a photograph. It's a CCTV still of a mystery man on a motorcycle caught near the crime scene. Now look at this reaction. Two totally contradictory things come out of her mouth in almost the exact same breath. First, she plays the shocked, devastated wife. She insists there's no way that he'd be capable of that. But then, almost instantly, she accidentally slips into confirmation mode, recounting Jonathan's own anxiety by saying they could place me there. Her surprise at the photo? Totally fake. Why? Because she and Jonathan had already been rehearsing his alibi for this exact piece of physical evidence on those wiretapped calls. But here's the absolute kicker, a piece of the puzzle that proves her shock in that room was completely manufactured. Jonathan later confessed that the shooting actually wasn't their first attempt on Robert's life. Weeks prior, they had prepared a banana pudding laced with poison. Seriously. But at the very last second, Sabrina panicked. She told Robert the bananas looked bad and made him throw the whole batch in the trash. Since there was no police report, detectives obviously didn't know about this during the interrogation. But it absolutely proves Sabrina was not encountering the idea of her husband's murder for the first time in that little room. She knew exactly how lethal this whole thing was. Okay, so as the detectives finally start cornering her with the wiretaps, Sabrina gets desperate. She tries to claim that all the panic, all the burner phones, all the secret whispered prayers, they were just because she was terrified of her affair getting out. But the detective hits her with this brilliantly strategic pushback. Do people really fear a DNA swab over a simple affair? Because if you listen to those wiretaps, they aren't just talking about keeping a romance quiet. Jonathan is specifically freaking out about his DNA being found at a murder scene. You don't stress about forensics if you just cheated. It's honestly fascinating how she tries to use morality to hide criminality. Sitting there in the interrogation room, she just keeps using the sin of adultery as a shield. She desperately wants the detectives to look at her and just see an embarrassed, cheating wife. But, as the detective rightly points out, if you are truly innocent of murder, you really don't care about a minor scandal when your husband has literally just been gunned down. You'd say, look, here are all my cards. Yes, I had an affair, but I swear I didn't kill him. Instead, she tries to downgrade a major homicide investigation into a manageable, everyday moral failing. And then, the detective pivots to his absolute trump card. It's a logical trap she can't escape. And it all comes down to the location itself. Remember, Robert was working at an incredibly remote, rarely used stop on his rail yard route. This was the kind of isolated industrial building you literally cannot just stumble upon by accident. There is zero plausible coincidence that puts a random killer or even Jonathan on his motorcycle at that specific location on that specific night just by chance. Someone had to describe it to him in incredibly precise detail.
And boom, here is the breaking point. Through her own uncontrollable habit of over-explaining, Sabrina eventually admits the one single fact she absolutely cannot take back. She confesses that, yeah, she provided Jonathan with Robert's highly specific schedule, the dates, and the exact physical location of his remote shift. Now ask yourself, why on earth would a wife tell her secret boyfriend the exact isolated location where her husband is going to be working completely alone in the dark? There's really only one logical reason, right?
By the end of those 5 exhaustive hours, Sabrina is totally backed into a corner. Her only remaining shield is this incredibly desperate technicality. She looks at the detectives and claims that Jonathan never explicitly spoke the words, "I killed him," to her out loud. But reality completely shatters that flimsy defense. An absence of that one specific literal sentence doesn't just magically erase hundreds of phone calls coordinating a fake alibi, agonizing over DNA evidence, and obsessively tracking the detectives' movements. It wasn't a confession she was lacking, it was plausible deniability. She knew. So how does this all actually play out in the end? Well, at the conclusion of that 5-hour interview, Sabrina was arrested. But incredibly, she actually walked out of custody days later. The prosecutors just didn't feel they had enough hard, physical proof to make the conspiracy charges stick without Jonathan's direct testimony. So the case went completely cold for over 2 years. But then, January 6, 2017, the dam finally breaks. Staring down a mountain of evidence, Jonathan Hearn flips. He takes a 25-year plea deal for voluntary manslaughter in exchange for testifying against Sabrina. And just days later, she's rearrested and headed straight to trial. Now, jury verdicts can sometimes be a mixed bag. But when this trial wrapped up in October 2017, the jury's decision was a masterclass in strict, fact-based logic. They didn't just blindly throw the book at her and convict her of everything. They actually rejected the specific accusations that Sabrina physically mixed or delivered that poisoned pudding. But they confidently accepted the foundational facts of the conspiracy, that Jonathan bought the arsenic, that Sabrina used the burner phone to hide the plot, and most importantly, that Sabrina provided that exact address. That one calculated action was enough to lock in a guilty verdict for first-degree murder.
Sabrina Limon gets 25 years to life in prison. But beyond the legal victory for the detectives, we really have to acknowledge the devastating collateral damage left in the wake of this. 2 young children were left waiting for a father who never came home from his shift that night. They ended up being raised by extended family, forced to grow up with a mother sitting in a prison cell, slowly having to piece together the awful reality of exactly how much she knew. It's just tragic.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with for this explainer. The physical trigger. Yes, that was pulled by Jonathan Hearn. But when a location is so incredibly isolated, so remote that a killer could never possibly find it on their own, was the address itself the murder weapon? Is handing a killer a highly specific location functionally the exact same thing as loading the gun for them? It's a really provocative question, but the jury certainly made their stance clear. Thanks so much for joining me as we unraveled this case. Keep analyzing, keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next one.